Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in our first installment of Public Health Speaker Series for the spring semester. We're really delighted to have our colleague with us today, Thuy Seelinger. I'm going to introduce her in just a second, but first I'd like to just kick us off with a few reminders that our speaker will talk for about 40-ish minutes, and then we'll have question and answers at the end. You can put your questions as we're going along. You can put those in the chat. Feel free to do that. Then at the end, we can also have a question and answer session where you can use the raise hand function, or you can just, come off of mute and ask your question live as well. So with that, I want to introduce our colleague, Thuy Seelinger, as our Public Health Speaker Series speaker this afternoon. Kim is an expert on sexual violence in armed conflict and forced displacement. She focuses on protection from gender-based violence in humanitarian contexts and accountability for these crimes in international and domestic courts. She has spent years working with judges, prosecutors, and victims advocates in East and West Africa on war crimes trials, including contributing to the prosecution and conviction of the former president of Chad. She has also conducted several multi-country studies focused on protection needs of forcibly displaced survivors of gender-based violence in Central America, the Mediterranean, and North and Sub-Saharan Africa. This work has also been integrated into global guidance for humanitarian response, as well as the investigation of conflict-related sexual violence. And in recognition of her global contributions and leadership, Kim has recently been appointed as a special advisor on sexual violence in conflict to the International Criminal Court prosecutor. Prior to joining Washington University School of Law, Seelinger taught at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where she directed the sexual violence program at the Human Rights Center. And at WashU, she is currently a research associate professor at the Brown School and a visiting professor at the School of Law. And she also serves as the founding director of the university's Center for Human Rights, Gender, and Migration in our Institute for Public Health. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kim. Thank you so much for being here, Kim.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you for spending your lunch break with me. I'm excited to share some thoughts, a rough overview of the things that I work on. But I just wanted to start with a little bit of a caveat. The nature of the work, as you must glean from the title, it's heavy material. It's not everyone's cup of tea. And if you, for any reason, feel like you want to tune out, I don't take it personally. I understand, right? I mean, it's not pleasant, the material that I work on. It is nonetheless important. And I'm assuming that if you are here, you're also interested in learning about it and potentially seeing how you can contribute to deepening understanding on these issues. So just so you know, I will be very careful to not go into graphic detail about anything, right? This is not the time or place for that, but just, we never know what things trigger emotional responses in ourselves. So just please feel free to do what you need to do, okay? I'm going to proceed, and if I'm just going to trust that you will take care of yourself as you need to, okay? As Professor Hobson mentioned, my name is Thuy Seelinger, and I'm relatively new to WashU. I've been here 2 years, mostly within the pandemic, so I haven't spent a whole lot of time on campus or met many of you, but I really look forward to it. And I wanted to welcome my colleague, who's the new center manager, Ariana Aramburu, who just chimed in. So if you have questions after the talk, you can reach Ariana or you can reach me, but we're both here representing the Center for Human Rights, Gender, and Migration. And our other colleague, Julie Utawal, is out of the office this week, so she's also there, but you can't reach her today. All right, I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to walk through with you. And as Professor Hobson mentioned, I'll take 35, 40 minutes of your time just talking at you if you don't mind. And then let's discuss. Let's get your reactions and your questions after that. I do this as a PDF now because PowerPoint is really slippery for me on Zoom. I apologize. But hopefully you can see the first slide here. Does it look all right? Can you see the whole thing?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So we are going to, can you see the list, the roadmap list? Or is it cut off?
We see the roadmap. I don't see a list.
Okay. Do you see the whole slide?
There we go. Yes.
Okay, so in the talk today, we're just going to introduce myself really briefly and then introduce some main terms and concepts. And then I want to talk about some myths and misconceptions that exist related to sexual violence and conflict. And then we'll talk about some theories of perpetration that have emerged over time and the importance of a holistic approach. And then we'll have a discussion, all right? So introduction, you heard about me already, but I just wanted to mention, just before this call, I was advised to tell you just very quickly how I became involved in this work. So I'm going to take 2 seconds to do that. Although I'm based at the Brown School, I'm not a social worker or public health expert necessarily. I'm actually a lawyer by training, and I started out after law school representing folks who needed protection from deportation in New York City. This is right after 9/11. And part of my caseload was clients who were fleeing all forms of persecution in their home countries, including a huge docket. I had mostly folks who were survivors of sexual violence, men, women, children. And so my foundational work as a lawyer was working with survivors who had fled, in many cases, conflict-related sexual violence. And I was happy to do that work. It felt meaningful, and I somehow was able to do it without incurring a lot of mental stress for myself. I had some longevity in it, but it did make me wonder about how we can, instead of putting Band-Aids on the issue and helping individuals seek safety in the United States, how do we get at the root causes? How do we address these issues from a more policy and 36,000 foot level? So this inspired me to do a little bit more work in time at the research level, working with practitioners and policymakers on how to fill the knowledge gaps they need in order to increase access to support and protection. So just so you know, I'm really quite a practitioner at heart, but the practice experience and those contacts fully informs the research that I've been doing for the last 15 years. All right, so that's way more than enough about me. Let's talk about some of the concepts. When we talk about sexual violence, we can use a number of different definitions. One that I like to use comes from the World Health Organization, right? And it is here on the slide. It's any act or attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances or acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person, regardless of their relationship with the victim, in any setting, including but not limited to home or work. This is an idea that just focuses on the sexual nature of the act that is conducted against someone's consent, right? And because I'm a lawyer and one of the governing legal instruments that looks at sexual violence in the armed conflict context, we look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which has this definition, right? Which I won't read out to you, but there is, there's a legal definition at the International Criminal Court that we use. This is just one form of sexual and gender-based crime that the International Court deals with, but this is the particular definition for sexual violence itself. It is, of course, related to and in some ways understood as part and one form of gender-based violence, which can be seen as much broader, right? Gender-based violence, they're not coterminous necessarily, but it is quite hard to envision a form of sexual violence that doesn't somehow implicate gender norms and is motivated partly by understandings of gender in the given society, right? So when we talk about gender-based violence, we can look at a few lead definitions. One comes from the UN Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is any act of violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. This is a definition from 1993. It is not a perfect definition. You see it as gender specific. And so generally we take this with a grain of salt. This definition came out of a UN entity in 1993. It is a declaration that was forged, took a lot of political compromise too. So this is a working definition. It is an imperfect working definition. We fully understand and try to think about gender-based violence as affecting more than just women, right? And so you have a more up-to-date definition coming out of the International Labor Organization labor organization, and others, which is violence directed at an individual or group of individuals based on their gender. It encompasses violence against women and girls, as well as violence against men and boys and individuals who are LGBTQI or do not conform to dominant gender roles. So we get more expansive definitions in time. We've evolved a bit since 1993. Armed conflict, again, this is not a law class, but just so you know, when we talk about, for the purposes of this presentation today, I'm talking about conflict-related sexual violence, right? And so when I say conflict, I'm not talking about just conflict that you may have with another person. We're drawing on the understanding of armed conflict from international law, which is largely provided to us in the Geneva Conventions of 1949. So essentially, international armed conflict, it's a case of war or other armed force conflict between two states, right? And you also, of course, don't forget, we have internal, non-international armed conflict that is also defined in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 through different provisions. Okay, so just the takeaway here for us is, this is the type of conflict we're talking about. This is not the only context in which some of these forms of harm arise, obviously, but this is just part of the terminology I wanted to go over. So then what does conflict-related sexual violence mean as a term of art itself? If we bracket these 4 words, what does it include? So we look often to the working definition offered by the UN Secretary General, who gives us this basket of harms: rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced marriage, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity perpetrated against women, men, girls, or boys that is directly or indirectly linked to a conflict. And it includes trafficking. So it's not a perfect definition, because still that relationship is not fully defined. What does it mean to be linked to a conflict, right? And this basket of harms is also reflected in the Rome Statute I mentioned earlier. So these are all the different types of sexual and gender-based crimes that at the International Criminal Court, the court might pursue in an investigation or a prosecution. So the link to the conflict, again, the same Secretary General report in 2019 makes it clear that there are different ways to think about that relationship, the conflict-related part, if you underscore related. It could be in the profile of the perpetrator, who might be a state or non-state actor who is an armed group, including terrorist entities. It could be that the conflict comes in the profile of the victim, right, who might be perceived or actually a member of a particular group that is targeted as part of the conflict, right? Or the general climate of impunity, right? We know that in times of armed conflict and political violence, systems break down, right? Support systems break down, law enforcement breaks down, national security looks in other directions and is not worried about sexual violence itself. It's looking at other, what they see as higher priority security risks. So there becomes a climate of impunity in many of these contexts, and that can also be what it links the sexual violence to the conflict. So this is a good reminder to not forget that things like intimate partner violence that exist in communities, of course, before any conflict breaks out, also persist through a conflict. And they're not generally what we think about when we talk about conflict-related sexual violence, but we can't ignore the fact that there is some baseline practices and harms that persist through a conflict, right? And affect conflict-affected communities to great degree, as evidence has shown. So this is very rough. I mean, armed conflict doesn't actually fall neatly into 3 stages like this. Often it's not linear. There are ebbs and flows and violence and multiple points of acute conflict. But if we think about sexual violence and armed conflict as happening in different phases, then you think about the types of sexual and gender-based violence that occur pre-conflict, right? If this were a class and we could interact more, then I would ask you to name, like, what are the types of sexual violence that exist in a community or any society in peacetime, right? And students typically will name things like rape, whether it's campus rape or some stranger rape, or they'll mention prostitution. Sometimes they'll mention honor killings, or they've heard about female genital mutilation. A whole list comes out. These are the facts that we live with in peacetime. Conflict Most of those things don't go away. They may be exacerbated, or they may be temporarily suppressed by other emergency. But then new forms of sexual violence will arise in conflict, right? And I often will ask students what they've heard about, what they know as new forms that arise, or new levels of frequency, or new actors that may come to the fore in a period of acute armed conflict. And this might include, we'll talk about it later, but you see higher rates of gang rape in conflict than you do in peacetime. And I'll get to some of those theories as to why later. You may see higher vulnerability to sexual exploitation by authorities as people try to cross borders and flee, right? So you can have a new level of risk and violence happening in conflict. And then even in post-conflict, as people are fleeing, they're not necessarily safe. I've never been to a refugee camp on the planet where sexual violence wasn't continuing to happen within the camp. Right? I've spent a lot of time in refugee camps, actually, and there are new risks that arise once people are displaced and separated from their protective networks, for example, or they have a legal status that they're not sure entitles them to police protection, or they may not, in fact, get police protection when they're no longer in their country. So these stages they present different forms of harm, different vulnerabilities and risk, which if we had more time, I would love to go into in much more detail with you about. So what does this look like? Historically, I don't know what types of examples are coming to mind for you. I'll move through some just so you see how these types of harms have arisen in different contexts. We know in Cambodia in the mid-1970s, under the Khmer Rouge regime, there were mass forced marriages, for example. This was part of the ideology of building a new proletariat generation of workers to serve the regime, right? And so thousands of people were married to each other in mass ceremonies with, generally speaking, very little say in who you were paired with. And not only were you now married to someone you had not chosen, you were then pressured and surveyed until you produced children with that person. The whole point was to create the new generation of workers, right? So that's a very simplistic coverage of this in limited time, but we saw forced marriage, mass forced marriage under Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Many of you, well, if you're students at Brown right now, you might be too young to remember this, but in the armed conflict, the civil wars and the unrest that affected the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, we learned of rape camps, for example. There were many people put in detention, but then women were pulled out of detention and put into hotels like this. This was Karaman's house in Foça, but they were kept in what was loosely termed rape camps. But this was part of the systemic violence that was happening in the context of that conflict. We know around the same time in 1994, we had basically 100-day genocide in Rwanda, and sexual violence featured heavily, not just as rape, but also forms of the mutilation of sexual organs. And often the rape was paired with murder. So a lot of the people who suffered rape were counted as victims of murder, but the rape itself was not acknowledged. And so we can make rough estimates as to the number of people who suffered rape in the genocide, but it would almost certainly be an undercount. We see in armed conflict also sexual violence perpetrated by and experienced by combatants, right? It's very complicated. There's some really fascinating research done based on interviews with former combatants who you would be surprised by the degree of sexual violence they themselves are subjected to within their ranks as part of their socialization process. And in the case of armed conflicts where abduction of children to serve as fighters. I'll get to it in a later slide, but Dara K. Cohen, who's at Harvard, has some, it was really such eye-opening and early research on the way sexual violence was used as a tool of social cohesion for children who were taken from their families and their villages and needed to be integrated into a new family unit in order to become a useful fighting team. So we see that with child soldiers. We see reproductive violence. This is a again, all of these photos, these are not people that we know to be survivors of anything. But we know of cases, for example, in the Colombian armed conflict, where women who were recruited into the FARC, the group that has sort of in opposition to the Colombian security forces, have routinely been subjected to, while they there's a lot of gender equality on the surface, right? Women serve as fighters in the FARC fully. They're armed, as you can see. They are also subjected to forced contraception. And if they get pregnant, we have many cases of forced abortion. And those cases are coming through the special tribunal in Colombia now, focused on many, many areas of violence, including sexual violence for that conflict. Oh, wow, I'm missing, or you can't, hey, there we go. Sale and enslavement. We also have, of course, you've heard of the sale and enslavement of Yazidi women. We have, for sexual purpose, for large part, we had this in many other conflicts, including in Chad, for example. So you see sexual slavery, which is inherent, an inherent part of slavery, actually, in many different contexts, armed conflict contexts around the world. I spared you most of this photo, but I just want to remind us that our own troops have been guilty at different points in time of sexual violence against civilians. Again, many of you may be too young to remember that our own military committed similar acts of sexual humiliation and torture during the Iraq War. This was a photo out of Abu Ghraib prison that I raised just to remind us that this is not something that only happens in other parts of the world, right? We are fully implicated in this type of violence ourselves. It also doesn't only happen to women. Again, you're spared the photo, but there's a pile of naked men on the floor there. And they're being humiliated in a way that is very specific to their religious identities. They're all Muslim men. And this form of humiliation was conducted as a specific way to break their spirit. Sexual violence in movement. We know that increased vulnerability arises when people are in flight. They may not have papers, they may not have money. I have represented so many women who just didn't have money, and they understood that their body was their currency. In fact, this train, I don't know how many of you know this, but this was the old train La Bestia that it brings people up through Mexico, right? This is a photo from several years ago, but this was one of the main vehicles that would bring people to the US-Mexico border from the south. And I'll tell you, in our research, we learned down at the Mexico-Guatemala border that so many women coming in from Central America, where they didn't know anything about their legal rights or what they were going to do for asylum when they got to the US, but they didn't know all the details of that. What they did know is before they stepped foot into Mexico, they needed Depo-Provera. They needed a contraceptive shot. They called it the anti-Mexico shot because they knew that, and they felt they were assuming the risk of rape once they continued on that voyage. And it was at least one way to mitigate the consequences of what they knew might happen to them. So there are clinics at the Mexico-Guatemala border that would provide contraception for women as they crossed over and continued this part of their voyage. We also know, as I mentioned, that sexual violence does not necessarily stop once you have fled the location of acute conflict. We just saw the slide about sexual violence in motion, but even in refugee camps and even at the hands of humanitarian workers and peacekeepers, we know that a good deal of sexual exploitation can still happen. And we've heard grotesque accounts of abuse at the hands of peacekeepers, including of young children. We've had cases in Haiti, Central African Republic. So I just mention it because it is complicated. It is complicated as an issue, right? It's not good guys and bad guys. All right, so those are some just overviews of what I'm talking about. Let's go through some myths and misconceptions. I've touched on a few of them already, actually, but, and I'm gonna draw from research. This is, I don't know if you can see the whole slide, but I'm sort of summarizing a really wonderful a brief that my colleagues Dara Cohen and Amelia Hoover Green and Elizabeth Wood put together for the US Institute for Peace a few years ago, where they outline sort of the hit parade, the 10 top myths that we've noticed surrounding conflict-related sexual violence. And I'll go very quickly just in the interest of time. But one is this idea that it's ubiquitous and it happens in all wars, everywhere, everyone does it, right? And to some degree, we know that sexual violence and war have happened together. Well, it's as old as war itself, right? It has happened for a very, very, very long time. And it is very common also. But research indicates that perhaps there is variation, right? Elizabeth Wood at Yale, is a very, very dear colleague. I highly recommend her work. She has for a long time studied the variation of wartime rape in particular. And she has found that over different conflicts, the rates of sexual violence at least being reported may rise and fall. She finds unequal distribution, not all armed actors conducted and committed to the same frequency or for the same reasons. And so you may see variation across time and geography and actor. We know myth number 2, sometimes when people talk about wartime sexual violence or conflict-related sexual violence, they always imagine Africa, right? It's sort of people's association as something that comes from the African continent. And this is so patently untrue. It affects conflict, it arises in conflicts everywhere. We talked about the former Yugoslavia. We know what our troops have done, not just in Abu Ghraib, but in Vietnam before then. It is not an Africa-specific problem, although much of the research study has focused on access to communities in Africa, but that's a different problem. It's not solely a problem of ethnic war also, right? We've seen high levels of rape we haven't seen high levels of rape reported in certain conflicts where one might expect this type of ethnic divide, right? Like in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in Sri Lanka. So this ethnic animus doesn't explain all of the motivation. Misconception number 4 is the idea that it's rebel groups that are committing this more than state actors. And again, there have been recent studies out of, for example, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo that shows that there's actually higher levels of reporting of perpetration by state actors in some conflicts, right? And this would indicate that perpetration isn't a question of poor training or resources, which is why we assume rebel groups and non-state actors can commit it. There may be variation in terms of what kind of sexual violence is perpetrated by state actors, but the fact is state actors perpetrate a lot of it. So you could look at, if you're interested in this question, another dear colleague, Michelle Levy's work on the very specific forms of sexual violence happening in detention by state actors, particularly for male victims, right? Interrogation, tactics, things like that. So you see high levels of certain sexual violence being enacted by state actors in many conflicts. Misconception 5, again, we touched on it earlier. It's not always, well, actually, we didn't touch on this one. Not always male perpetrators. Most of us haven't thought, I mean, it's been quite recent that we've been opening our eyes and thinking to the idea of victim perpetrator, female perpetrators. Right? We have many, many examples of women throughout time who have been complicit and active participants in the sexual violence of non-combatants, for example, right? So I don't know if you recall, I mean, during the Nazi regime, women nurses helped conduct a lot of the forced sterilization of Jewish prisoners. A lot of the medical experimentation was done and conducted by actually a couple nurses, some of whom were actually prosecuted later. We have women commanders, like Martina Johnson out of Liberia. She's a mid-level artillery commander in the Liberian civil conflict, who was just brought up to trial in Belgium, where she's been living with asylum for the last 15, 20 years. So, and we had cases out of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. We had one case there of a female minister of gender, actually, who was implicated in some of these harms. So we have to keep our eyes open to the fact that women, for many different reasons potentially, can also be perpetrators. And in fact, some of the population-based studies that were conducted by Lynn Laurie's group and Kirsten Johnson's group, for example, revealed surprisingly high levels of female involvement, or reports of women being involved in the sexual violence that the respondents to the surveys had experienced. Misconception 6, opportunism, and by this I mean there is some idea that all of this just happens because it's a couple bad apples, right? It's just a couple bad soldiers who go out and are out of line, right? It's purely individually motivated. We'll get into these theories in a minute, but it's that type of opportunism or patriarchy is not, it doesn't explain how widespread sexual violence can be and the manners in which it's conducted in some conflicts. So while it may account for some of what happens, it certainly doesn't account for all of it. The myth number 7 that the team highlighted was that it's always perpetrated by combatants, but we know that in fact, there are many, many cases and studies that reveal that non-combatants do commit sexual violence in conflict-affected settings. They may have different reasons to and different access. But for example, we have heard, of course, about peacekeepers. We've heard about humanitarian workers demanding transactional sex or withholding food rations for sexual favors. And this is also a form of sexual violence. And as I mentioned before, intimate partner violence, so violence that can happen at the hands of your spouse or your partner, is indicated in research to be actually the most common form of gender-based violence suffered by individuals in conflict-affected settings. So if you look simply at numerosity, these very private forms of harm, sexual harm that may happen at the hands of your partner still affect more people than the idea of soldiers running in to raid people in a village. Misconception 8, victims always female. We touched on this earlier, so I won't belabor it, but we have numerous cases and additional evidence of male survivors of sexual violence. In fact, in the same studies by Lynn Laurie and Kirsten Johnson, they conducted studies in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. There were surprisingly high levels of experience that men reported, actually. I think over 30% in most of those cases, actually. Over 30% of the male respondents had experienced sexual violence in their time during the conflict. So that is surprisingly high for many of us. And part of the reason we don't know more is that we've not been asking men, and we haven't really thought about the possibility of male victims. So all of the surveys, all of the knowledge that we have has always presumed a male perpetrator, female victim binary. And that has produced, that's resulted in a very limited scope of knowledge. But now that we're asking more fully, we're getting much more information about how it's much more complicated than that. And I would note the general invisibility of LGBTQI individuals, right, whom we know have, at least again, since the Nazi era, been targeted for very specific forms of abuse because of who they are and their identities. Misconception number 9. Incidence is increasing or decreasing or steady, right? People make claims one way or the other. The fact is we just don't know. Like, we don't have common terms. We don't have enough data. We've got a huge disparity in measurement. So we are nowhere near being able to actually ascertain trends and have any certainty about where rates are going up, going down, or not changing at all. And misconception 10 is related, I think, to misconception 6. I don't know why it's in this order, but there are other folks who assume that all wartime sexual violence is strategic, right? And that's not necessarily the case. And we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about theories. All right, I'm gonna keep moving. So theories of perpetration, I'll be quick here because I have 5 minutes. I know you know who 2 of these people are. The guy in the middle is a Brit who is in dark. This is William Hague. So the 3 of them, Angelina Jolie, William Hague, and Brad Pitt, all showed up in 2014 for this big summit on ending conflict-related sexual violence that the UK government hosted. And many of us who were there and presenting, this is a whole separate conversation, but anyway, the rhetoric or the messaging that many the mainstream news media and also celebrities and many policymakers adopt is this idea of rape as a weapon of war, right? Which is tied to that last misconception I mentioned. It's weapon of war, it's not a legal term, right? So it's not something we can do anything with in terms of accountability, but it does express this idea that rape is being used as a way to advance some sort of military objective in a conflict situation, which explains some of it, but it's a simplification. And I'm going to show you maybe more nuanced ways of thinking about why this happens. There's a bit of theorizing that's happened over time. Again, I won't go into the details, but various scholars have pointed to different reasons that they think this type of form happens that might be distinct from some other forms of atrocities that occur during armed conflict. One simple, but I think insufficient reason was the idea of biology, male sexual urges, right? Which cannot on its own explain it, because the sexual urges may be the same even in peacetime, and yet we don't see these types of violence happening to this degree in peacetime. So perhaps maybe biology is not irrelevant, but other scholars have looked at the spiral of violence and talked about how with the spreading breakdown of security and systems, you end up becoming desensitized. All the horrors of war can lead to a desensitization and increase of violence of many forms, including of sexual violence. We have theories about militarization and masculinities, right? Which is a little bit about the identities and the formation, the psychological formation and impacts of war on the people who fight it. So this, we would look at some of the security studies and the psychology of war studies here for that idea. And then Cohen, for example, builds off of socialization theory to talk about social cohesion, which I'll get to. I have a slide on that for you because I find that one particularly interesting and compelling. So Cohen is borrowing from Jekyll's socialization framework. And can you see the whole slide here or just the top two? Oh, sorry. I don't know if you can, no, I'll try to make this bigger. Okay. So just briefly, the idea between this socialization framework is that there are different degrees of sort of integration and socialization that might happen generally. This is not, Jekyll was not talking about combatants necessarily, but at the first level, you have rational calculation of, rational calculation of a group member in response to incentives. It's very transactional. It's like, it may be coercive or it may not, but no internalization of the norms occurs. And there's no expectation that the individual conforms to those behaviors and norms after he or she leaves the group, right? The next level, type 1, would be that the individual exhibits the pro-group behavior by learning his or her role, acquiring the knowledge that enables action in accordance with group expectations. The beliefs associated with the role do not replace the person's earlier values, they just get superimposed on top of them. And they're entirely dependent on that person's continuing and ongoing membership in the group. There's no expectation that once you leave, you will continue to abide by those behaviors. The final level is that the individual accepts the group norms as the right thing to do. They adopt the interest or possibly identity of the community of which they're now a member. And this is a conscious instrumental calculation and role playing that's been, it gets replaced by a taken for grantedness or full internalization. And so the behavior that is formed and derived from that internalization gradually becomes independent of the external source, which is the group, and that person carries it with them even after they leave the group. So this is the deepening, this is the deepest level that Jekyll describes in terms of socialization. So Cohen, and again, I just find this theory so interesting that I wanted to share it with you a little bit more than the other theories. So Dara Cohen, she conducted a good bit of research in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and she interviewed many former combatants about conflict-related sexual violence. And in the course of many of her interviews, and she's not the only scholar who's done this, Jocelyn Kelly's done terrific work this way, a number of Maria Erickson-Baz, but I just want to share Dara's work in limited time. You know, she has a couple of quotes I put here. The new guys never wanted to rape, but they were mocked a bit and treated like they were not serious rebels. So after a few months, they got acclimated to the rape, right? Or some men chose not to rape and they were teased. We'd ask them, maybe you are homosexual, right? So this is part of the socialization process that Dara presents in her theory. She had other findings, right? She concludes, right, that soldiers can and do resist, but not all of them can. And certain of them will not pay social costs for resisting. Some of them really might. She found that abduction by armed groups is associated with increased reports of wartime rape, and specifically in conflicts where the abduction of children to fight is present, you see high rates of gang rape. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier, her thinking is that when you abduct a child from their home, they are terrified, they miss their parents, right? They miss their friends, they miss school if they were in school. You have to rebuild them and give them a new family. And one way to do that, particularly with young people, is to remap their moral universe and their affiliations. So having children, young people transgress together can remap how they think. And once they've all transgressed, this becomes a new normal, and these are their brothers in doing that, or sisters sometimes. Scope conditions, she found that some people can resist social pressure to commit violence. For example, folks who are older and not child recruits tended to be able to resist, it seems. Those who had earlier firm and formal socialization experiences were less vulnerable and less malleable to new socialization in an armed group. And those who felt physically secure, their physical security was not threatened. They didn't think they were going to get beaten or killed if they didn't listen, right? So someone with higher seniority or command level, potentially. This feeds into this idea of the typology, right? And so often, for a very long time, folks either thought that, well, rape and sexual violence and armed conflict is either opportunistic and just individually, it's aberrant behavior, or it's strategic and fulfills military objectives. Cynthia Enloe, who many great scholars cite, had earlier posited these ideas of recreational rape, national security rape, systemic mass rape. Where we are now is really incorporating Elizabeth Wood's theorizing that between opportunistic and strategic rape, we also have wartime sexual violence as a practice. I'm going to move super fast and just tell you, well, all that means is that things may not be totally random and they may not be ordered as part of a policy. You have a lot of sexual violence that happens because of social norms within an armed group. It's the horizontal pressures that group members exert on each other, indicating what behavior is not ordered but might be tolerated, right? It's just something that you do and it's not punished, right? And not tolerated. Okay, I'll move very quickly now. Okay, so just quickly, the need for a holistic approach. This, I think, since we are a Brown School audience for the most part, this is where I want you to see how important your role as public health and social work experts could be, right? First of all, law students don't know what an ecological model is, so it's always helpful to show them, right? Let's talk about impact this way, right? Everyone focuses on the individual impact, and so we know, right? We have health level consequence, we have things that happen to a survivor, right? And then of course there are impacts at the interpersonal level. For example, a lot of folks who experience this, they may, with good reason, worry that their husband will abandon them if they're a woman, right? There's so much stigma that attaches that you may have very serious consequences in your close relationships. At the community level, stigma can carry at that level, obviously. You have societal impacts also, and then you have national security issues potentially and supranational response. So in the interest of time, I won't go into all this, but I think if one understands that conflict-related sexual violence has impact at so many levels, then it helps us think about the need for a holistic response also, right? So the types of impact, obviously health, we have physical consequences, risk of infection, pregnancy, physical injury, mental health impacts, which I won't go into, but clearly many survivors experience at least depression and anxiety after, but of course may exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality. We have socioeconomic impacts. I mentioned abandonment, potentially by your spouse, which can lead to loss of support or inheritance or even your place in your home. which can then lead to economic hardship, right? Or you have other economic exclusion at the social level, so community level due to stigma. You may then become vulnerable to increased risk of exploitation, which may also be in the form of sexual exploitation. Illegal and security challenges, you may have challenges reporting to the authorities, or you may have security risks because you risk retaliation should you report to anyone. And then we have transgenerational impacts. Trauma can be passed on in many different ways to your children. Impacts of stigma that result from this type of harm can, in very concrete and non-concrete ways, affect your children. And then, of course, children may be born to you if your case was actually a case of rape. And then we have national and international security implications also, and impacts mass displacement when we see rape happening at a community level. This can lead and be related to border enforcement and restrictions and the fueling or prolongation of conflict. There is, of course, a holistic approach to care and accountability. This is one of my dear colleagues and heroes, really, Dr. Denis Mukwege, who was one of the recipients of the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. He directs the Panzi Hospital in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which provides medical care, psychosocial support, socioeconomic reintegration, and legal services in one, well, it's not literally one roof, it's two roofs because it's two buildings. It's a hospital and the foundation. But that type of holistic wraparound co-located service is so important for survivors who have multifaceted needs coming from such a complex form of harm. And similarly, we know that even in non-conflict settings, it's important to have lawyers, if they're going to work on access to justice, work very closely with social workers and psychologists to ensure they're not doing any harm to survivors in the process. And also, non-legal providers may be important sources of evidence, documentary evidence of psychological well-being or mental health that can be helpful in a court case should someone want to proceed. My final slide is that I've always tried to take the holistic approach to the research also. And in 30 seconds, I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, so far global actors have really focused on response to conflict-related sexual violence, and they know prevention is important, but they haven't really integrated it. And so the idea of bringing in more public health expertise to help the lawyers and the judges and the international relations people understand prevention is very important. And thankfully, the current special representative in sexual violence and conflict, Pramila Patton, is developing a prevention framework to present to the UN General Assembly and others in June. And I'm fortunate my center and I will be helping her develop that, but we'll keep you posted if you're interested. But basically every project, it's like the story, the idea of all the 10 different blind men touching different parts of the elephant. They have different disciplines, have a different understanding and approach to a complex human rights issue, whatever it is. And so it's really only by bringing public health experts, social work experts, historians, anthropologists, lawyers together, political scientists together, can we get a full picture of something as complex as this? And that's why in all of our projects, we staff them with students also from the Brown School, from the law school, from the medical school, so that they can each bring their research approach and their insights together, and we can have a more holistic memo or report or study design. So I'll stop there because I think I've gone over a bit, Professor Hobson, I'm very sorry, but I'm delighted to entertain your questions and your thoughts now.
Great, thank you so much, Kim, and no apology needed. That was a really wonderful talk, and so much there, and I applaud you for this work because I know it can't be easy. It's got to be difficult emotionally to be involved in this type of work. And I think in the chat so far, we just have a couple of comments. One, thank you from our colleague Janelle Gibson, and then also our colleague Niall Tutlam is, making the point about state actors being perpetrators really resonates, and in their case in South Sudanese conflict, government troops are arguably committing sexual violence even more than the rebel forces. So I think he's highlighting the importance of keeping that in mind too when thinking about the perpetrators of sexual violence and armed conflict. It looks like we have a question. Is this a question? Yeah, from Yosef. What is the maximum power of the international community to stop an ongoing sexual violence than acknowledging, condemning, or sanction? I saw a direct involvement when biological weapons were used.
Yeah. One of the main tools that the international community can use in direct response to try to stop something is the sanctions regime. So oftentimes you'll have the listing of particular groups that are believed to be committing this type of violence, and that can lead to the adoption of sanctions by the Security Council, for example. Unclear how deterrent that actually is, to be frank. I mean, I think it's a bit of a blunt instrument, and it doesn't really change a lot of what happens on the ground and may not be reported. But I think most of the focus, Yosef, is on trying to collect documentation for later prosecution, which again is insufficient, frankly. It's an important part of response, but it's not going to deter. There's no evidence that prosecution deters this from happening. I have not heard of cases where biological weapons were used specifically to stop conflict-related sexual violence. I honestly don't think it's enough of a priority for those who hold those weapons. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Ellie, I see your hand raised.
Sorry, wrong button. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. This was incredible and so enlightening. And I'm really interested in what you're talking about with starting to think about prevention, especially in these conflict settings where we might not have that much access to the people experiencing violence. So I'm really curious, like, what kinds of stakeholders you're thinking about engaging as you conceptualize prevention efforts.
Yeah, this is such a good question, Ellie, and we're trying to work up the framework right now. So if you want to work on it with me, let me know. But you have to think of prevention again at all those levels, right? Like if we're talking about the individual level, the dynamic between the individual perpetrator and the individual victim, then we talk about behavior change and gender equity, period, right? Like then we are changing social norms about gender and power. Like that is so crucial, and that is really, really hard to do. But there are a lot of folks who have been working on that. Like a great group out of Kampala, Raising Voices, has been working on that and has a wonderful set of evaluated tools for that. So we talk a sort of behavior change there. But then also, Libby Wood's scholarship points to the fact that because we have variation in the actions of armed groups, it shows that most armed groups can control when they actually want to. So the puzzle she poses for us is, how are you going to incentivize the commanders to actually exercise, like make it in their best interest? And how do you do that? Do you tell them do you point out how much fighting power they lose to folks who are down with sexually transmitted infections, right? Or so, like, how do you appeal to commanders to think of ruling this out in their own best interest? Potentially prosecution might be part of it, but honestly, I don't believe it. And I'm sorry that we're being recorded. A lot of people, some of your highly ranked colleagues of mine may feel it. I think prosecution is important. I don't see evidence that it actually deters. So I think we have to appeal to, how do we incentivize commanders? Like, what is in their best interest, and how do we show them that, fine, this does not have to be one of your tools.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more. I'm going to do one in the chat, and then Camille, I'll come back to you. We have a question in the chat that says, grateful that you highlight female actors in this discourse as it's something I'm focusing on in my research. Does the publication that highlighted the myths and misconceptions talk more about that?
It does. There's a bit on female perpetration. I have a lot more because I'm obsessed with this question. And I have when I teach this as a course at the law school, I'm happy if you contact me, Deanna, I'll send you that part of my syllabus that has some really helpful literature on this. It's emerging. It's very recent. There's just a little bit of academic literature, but there's a lot more examples of cases, right? And some theorizing. In the meantime, look up Laura Sjoberg, Sjoberg, out of Florida. She's got some really fascinating work out on female perpetration. But yeah, I'll put my email in the chat for you.
Great, thank you. And then Camille, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. That was really gave me a lot to think about. And what I'm about to ask is not fully formed, so forgive me for that. But, you know, a lot of the stuff you talked about, especially with like the child soldiers, reminded me, you know, of the concept of enemy, with like the breakdown of social norms and trying to kind of reestablish them, like people becoming lost without having, you know, the previous cultural normative behavior. And so then that internalization framework that you put, you know, there's like type 2 internalization. There's that idea, right? Something becomes a total social fact where you no longer question it. It is just part of like society. So I guess my question then is, with thinking about those concepts, I mean, what happens after? Is there, and this might actually go a little bit to Professor Tranny's question in the chat. Is there research on what happens once, you know, these individuals leave those specific, you know, cultural, like unique in some ways, right, cultural circumstances, and try to reintegrate into society? Or I guess, yeah, what happens after?
It's such a great question. And Professor Tranny, I'm sorry I didn't see your comment. I should have addressed it earlier. It's a great question. There is research and work focused on the reintegration of former child soldiers in particular. We have that. I'm most familiar with it in northern Uganda, but also in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And it's very hard, both for boys. The boys are feared, right? They're feared as enemies of their birth community, right? And so they are rejected and they are viewed with a huge degree of suspicion, and reintegration is very hard for them. In Uganda, it's interesting though, because the boys who came back, the male combatants, as part of the amnesty and the transitional justice package, were given a plot of land and money, whereas the women who came back didn't receive the same package. They weren't seen as needing that, but they were still viewed with suspicion. They were not allowed to enter schools again. And so groups, women like Alice Acheng, I think, who started, you know, special schools for girls who were returned after being abducted and kept in captivity by the Lord's Resistance Army for so many years, because they could go to school and have their children taken care of and get vocational training and move on with their lives. So I think that it's hard. And when you have a situation like in Liberia, where there's so little access to mental health care support, plus where recruitment relied so heavily on building addiction to substances, right? Alcohol, drugs, you end up with substance abuse and addiction after that goes totally untreated, right? And is tied to a lot of the mental health burden. So I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but it's such a good question, Camille. And I think it is incredibly difficult unless there's sustained programmatic support for the transition, plus like intentional carve outs for education, vocational training, and ways to build livelihood. Otherwise, you end up with kids who come back, they don't have a job, they end up in the street, they regroup again, and they just turn to lives of petty crime or organized crime when they're back, and which keeps them on the margins forever, right?
All right, thank you so much. I know we're right at 1 o'clock, so I want to thank everyone for being here today, but a special thanks to Kim for your time here and this really wonderful talk and your fantastic work. So thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.